Okay, so hello, welcome to the latest in our series of Fieldfisher Silicon Valley webinars. I'm Alexander Degay. Joining me in our high-tech studio is Mark Webber. Say hello, Mark.
Hello, Mark. Good morning, everybody.
And Paul Lanois.
Hello.
And for us here in sunny California, although it's not actually sunny at all today, it's kind of almost raining. Good mid-morning if you're in the East Coast, and good evening to those of us from to those of you joining from Europe. Thank you for sticking around the end of your day. So just to introduce the three of us, so I'm Alex Degay. As I said, I'm an associate here in the Silicon Valley office, having on long-term secondment from the London team. Mark Webber is the boss of this particular operation, and he's taken us from a small couple of guys with laptops to a broadening empire of some 12, maybe, what are we now, 15 people? A couple of new ones joining. And Paul is an all-round security expert, director in the team here. So we've titled this one Security Considerations for Deal Makers. And the idea is essentially we're going to talk about security, but it's not a pure the idea is we're trying to think of some practical considerations. We've gone through a lot of DPA negotiations, and a lot of security questions come up. So we're trying to think of security in the wider deal context. And when we say deal, we're mainly talking about transactional deals here, not mergers and acquisitions, but that will of course come up because there's some recent news there. But if you want more detail on that, you can check our recent M&A webinar. And in fact, you can see all of the ones, we put them all on our YouTube channel. The link is at the very end of the slide, so you have to stay for that. Or you can just go on YouTube and search Fieldfisher Silicon Valley, and you'll find us there. Some quick housekeeping before we get going. We're going to try and keep this to around 45 minutes as usual. If we run out of stuff to say, we'll finish early. But as normally, we're kind of rushing to get through everything. So you won't be here for too long. You can ask questions if you want. There's a question function in the GoToWebinar dashboard. We do see those, so we'll try and get to those as we go along. At the end, if we have additional time. What else? Oh yeah, we'll share the recording. So you don't have to sort of take screenshots or anything. We'll put that on the YouTube channel. So without further ado, let's see if the slides change. Okay, great. So here's what we're going to try and cover today. So why it matters, that security is it, what GDPR says, some recent breach news, key considerations for security issues in the deal context, a bit about audit rights and who's scheduled to use, and then some tips, which is we'll share some knowledge from all the exciting information we picked up the last couple of years of working in this area. So why does it matter? Well, Paul, perhaps you can start us off. Why do you think security is important in the deal context?
Thank you very much, Alex. Security is, of course, a very important topic, and we've all seen and heard, in the headlines, stories about data breaches, security incidents, and so forth, which have made the headlines. And obviously, it shows that there is a lot of things, going around in that area. But more practically, why it matters, I would say that if as an organization you lose, for example, your trade secrets, your business plans, your intellectual property because somebody accessed that information, well, that's obviously a big issue as well. But then there is also the risk that you may lose sensitive information. I don't say sensitive in the meaning, in a sense meant, for example, by the GDPR and so forth. I mean sensitive in the sense that, if you lose information relating to your customers, your business partners, and so forth, well, that's information which may have a organization because perhaps those business partners or customers, they may not want to come back to you because, the information has been leaked. Employees as well, if you lose employee information, well, that's obviously a big issue as well. And for all of these reasons, if there is a security incident happening in your organization, well, there is the potential, for a lot of reputation damage. It's good to be in the news, but you don't want to be in the news for all the bad reasons. So you don't want to be in the news because there is a data breach at your organization and lots of data has been leaked. You don't want emails, confidential emails, about what's going on within your organization to be leaked online. That's something which has happened for some companies already, where the data has been leaked online, and then people could then easily access, seek confidential email communications which took place within the organization. Litigation and compliance risk as well. Well, if you suffer a data breach, well, you're going to have customers who are going to be unhappy. You will have regulators looking into what you're doing. There may be legal action taken against your organization as well if it is found that you did not do enough to protect the information. Shareholder value as well. Well, if you suffer a data breach, well, it's likely that you're going to suffer, a loss in relation to your share value and so forth, because people are unhappy. And of course, if we're talking about an M&A deal, this means, and this has already happened in the past, if there is an acquisition which is which is underway or which is being planned, well, if there is a data breach, well, because of the whole impact of the data breach, this often means that there's going to be a lot of pushback in relation to the price, and the price will often drop. We've seen that in some recent cases as well. The one which is often quoted, I would say, would be the Yahoo case, which led to a huge drop in the acquisition price. It was more than $300 million, right?
That's what I thought. Yeah, it's a huge impact. Yeah, and I remember from when we were first starting out doing this, we talked about the remedial costs, but actually the reputational damage is often the most impactful things. You can't really quantify that. Mark, why do you think this stuff's important? Anything to add to the list there?
Well, I think Paul's given a good summary of the importance. I think I'd come back to two areas where we're seeing heightened importance. We've just come out of the back of a PE acquisition into one of our clients, data rich. A lot of focus in that space in their due diligence, and we'll come on to talk about that. And I know the team talked about that in prior webinars. But people see the significance of that, and I wonder whether some of this is, we're very focused on GDPR out in this team, and of course the majority of our advice is there. But we shouldn't ignore the CCPA, the California rules, which are coming in at the beginning of next year and being enforced in the middle of next year. They're going to introduce, private right of action for security breaches. There's a renewed focus about the potential liability. Paul talked about shareholder value. That's clearly there for larger companies, but smaller companies fear individual action, which is technically there under the GDPR from data subjects, empowered to recover for pecuniary and non-pecuniary losses. But we're also seeing this new mobilization under other laws, which could well have an impact, and it's certainly making businesses think in terms of their potential liability and how they can cover that off and explain that. And I think that's a theme that we'll come to as we talk about what the GDPR says about security and the kind of deal impact we have, because people are worried about what might go wrong. It doesn't always go wrong, but they're trying to protect themselves contractually when doing some of these deals, right? So,
absolutely. It comes up every time. My experience, it's a real bone of contention. People often even ignore the fact they get fixated on this idea of risk, and they hear about these huge fines or these newspaper headlines, and that's what the deal gets stuck on. So speaking of which, we have a couple of headlines here. Paul, you suggested these ones, so can you talk us through why these are significant?
Certainly. Well, actually, I don't want to focus specifically on this this incident. Those are more examples of what could happen. And for example, on this slide, you can see here, this is a classic, typical example, I would say, because first you have an acquisition which took place. In this case, it's an acquisition of a company in relation to their the solution, the platform. It was an acquisition for 200 million. And what happened was that shortly afterwards, so in this case, just 1 month afterwards, there was a it was discovered that there was a data breach affecting 1.4 million customers, and there was a huge drop as well in relation to the share price of the company. In this case, it was about 4%, I think. This is a classic example, I would say, of what could happen and what you don't want to happen, right? You buy a company, you think that this is great, we are going to be able to leverage the solutions, the platform, and we're going to expand and grow, and actually what happens is that you actually lose value, you lose customer trust and so forth, because there hasn't been sufficient due diligence being done. And in relation specifically to this case, according to media reports, the data breach apparently was discovered not by the companies directly, but apparently it was discovered by security researchers who found the data being sold on the black markets. And then what happened was that people notified the company apparently, and that's how the data breach was discovered. And this is often as well, what may happen, right? Because many times an organization may not even know that they were breached, and it's because they were alerted. There were some signs, which appeared, and that's only when they discovered that there is a data breach which took place. Earlier I mentioned the Yahoo case as well, in relation to
that was a big one,
Verizon, and that's the big case which is often quoted in relation to to security having a huge impact on M&A transactions. And just to quickly recap, what happened for those of you who forgot about it. What happened was that after Verizon announced their plans to acquire Yahoo back in 2016, it was discovered that 2 data breaches in 2013 and in 2014, affecting more than 1 billion user accounts. As I mentioned earlier, what happened was that because of this incident, this data breach which took place, that led to the sale price to be reduced by $350 million. There were significant delays as well in closing the deal. There was a lot of litigation as well. There was a class action. The company had to pay $85 million to settle the class action. There were FTC remediation measures which were imposed. The general counsel left the company, and the board also said that they would not pay the annual bonus to the CEO of the company.
Yeah, I mean, it's headline stuff. It's getting to the board. It's interesting. They still proceeded, though, didn't they? It didn't stop the acquisition, but it just reduced the price significantly and had all those other impacts. So there's another example here. I guess that's pretty similar. So big acquisition in July, and then headlines later in September, and massive, over 2 million users affected. So let's move on to what the GDPR actually says. So Article 32, I'm sure you're probably all familiar with it. Read it at your leisure. When I put this slide together, I just had the word appropriate, because I think the point, with GDPR is it basically doesn't say anything prescriptive about what security is. It just puts the onus on you as controller or as processor to determine what's appropriate. And what's appropriate, of course, depends on a number of factors. But we've underlined some stuff here because some of these other things are a little relevant. So, state of the art, costs, nature, scope, context. So that's to give you some feel. And you've probably seen in some deals, some people actually copy that entire paragraph out, which I don't think is necessary. But anyway, those are kind of those are pretty much the only indicators you get and the relevant recital, but essentially it just says appropriate technical and organizational measures.
And Alex, we can talk about this in a little more detail, but I think I'd say that this often comes as a surprise to people who aren't familiar with the GDPR, because where we often get, can we have a call please on, what the GDPR says about security? And actually, what we're showing you here is it says very little.
Yeah.
And I think that's important because this is one of the things that makes deals difficult, is because it doesn't say much. It leaves it up to some people to interpret and decide what good is. And there's an element of discretion in there for different businesses, and one person's appropriate may not be another person's appropriate, or they may have decided to take a completely difficult technological approach within their stack. So there's, it's one of the difficulties of GDPR. But if we step back and think about what the GDPR is trying to do, we could, unless it's reformed, have this legislation on the books for the next 30 years. If we started defining what good looks like in a piece of legislation, it's going to be out of date almost before it becomes applicable. The other thing, as a principle-based piece of legislation, this applies to the sort of proverbial church group that's dealing with their sort of regular funding meeting, to the likes of some of the biggest hosts on the planet. And Article 32 has got to be read in context. So we're looking at the nature, scope, context, and purposes of processing, and that contextual analysis is very important. And it also lets you apply a risk analysis, as we'll go on and talk about, in terms of state of the art and how much it costs. You can't expect that church group to spend the same amount of money on encryption as you can one of the largest hosting providers on the planet. So it works, but I think that's probably the inherent difficulty, which we'll talk about for the rest of this session. So.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense. It's the only way to really be future-proof, is to be non-prescriptive. If you said, passwords must change every 30 days, and then security experts decide actually that's a weakness rather than a strength, the legislation's already out of date. And it's a handy way of the legislators just saying, part of the accountability, I suppose, that runs through the GDPR is it's more putting the onus on you to look at things and make that risk assessment yourself.
Yeah, and interestingly, if we just sort of step back, focusing on security, if you think of the other protections that should be in place in respect of data, Article 28, those terms that need to be in place between controller and a processor, which are also part of the negotiations we're likely to talk about. Article 28 doesn't really vary. You can have 2 names and an email address, and the Article 28 terms apply. You can have 28 million or 28 billion names and an email addresses, and you've still got the same core terms to apply. So this is another thing I see businesses wrestle with. That's the minimum that has to be in place in those scenarios. It also talks about having appropriate security. So one of the things that does change between that small deal with just a handful of email addresses and the very large with a lot of email addresses or a lot of sensitive data is the security wrapper that goes around that data, because you would naturally be expected to do more based on the fact you've got a lot more data. And then we're talking about the nature of the data. Well, is it more sensitive? Is there a higher volume? Scope, you've got more data. Context, well, church group versus large enterprise expecting to do more. And then the purposes of processing, what people are doing with that data. You really need to be stepping back to make that evaluation. The suppliers out there that are thinking about their solutions need to be thinking about that in context, because there are other things that you can do to protect the type of data you'll handle. And we have a number of SaaS vendors we work with who simply say, look, we don't want sensitive data, or we don't want large volumes of data. So they actually work contractually to prohibit or prevent the uploading of certain data to their systems, because they're only designing for a certain type of solution. And the security is going to have to flex and be interpreted in the context of that data and the purposes of the processing of that data we're talking about. So.
And they essentially say, this is what's appropriate, and therefore you can't give us stuff that would make it inappropriate. So let's look a little more at appropriate. So I've given an example visually of dress code. This is us here in Silicon Valley on the far right, and London team somewhere on the far left, or probably in the middle. But to get, appropriate, it's the same thing. A lot of businesses will have an appropriate dress code. So what that means depends on the context. So here are some of the factors you've got to consider. So obviously the data, itself, how much of it, how sensitive it is, where you're sending it, if it's valuable to someone else. Paul, you got anything to say on any of these factors?
Yeah,
it's important.
Yeah, certainly, I would say that, and it's probably why the GDPR is vague, in that respect, is that, it really depends on what the organization does, in which industry is it sitting in, what is the value of the information that the company has, not only in relation to, how much value a competitor would put a price on that information, but also what hackers may want to do with that information. So, for example, if you are sitting on, a lot of into payment cards and so forth, well, of course, that's going to have a lot of value for hackers. Do you, what do you do as well in relation to the data? Do you collect, lots of information, not so much, and depending as well on the volume, the size and so forth, the sensitivity of the information, well, it's going to attract more or less hackers and also, other interested parties.
Yeah, and yeah, it's a contextual analysis, of course. It's going to be fact dependent, and then the two parties, if you're in a negotiation, will probably view things slightly differently. But we added at the bottom there that the whole point about certifications, just because that slightly flavors it, in that there are these GDPR allows for certifications, although none have been approved yet. But then there are also third-party ones. We're thinking about ISO and that new one, 27700.
So the extension 27701 from 2019, the one that deals with privacy management systems and information management requirements.
And you think those are useful, Mark, to say, well, it's appropriate because we've got this, or you need this to be appropriate?
They are useful because they set a standard. I think this is one of the areas that, let's talk about two things. One, having ISO 27001 is definitely not a symbol that you're GDPR compliant, whatever that means. We see that used quite a lot in the market because the presence of standards do two things. They give you a framework to work under and let you, treat your data and protect that data in a certain way. They also are a tool to demonstrate to the outside world that you've met a certain standard in relation to data. I think you've got to be very careful with this. So, we're sitting in a room here. You could get ISO 27001 in respect of this room or a particular data. It doesn't mean it's there in respect of your entire business. So you need to look under the hood, as it were. But they definitely are useful, and I think they're particularly useful to growing vendor businesses because they're one that, as I said, they let them demonstrate, but then when they're approved standards, they can actually be examined and then attested to by an outside third party. So while I am trying to sell you something as a SaaS vendor, I say, yeah, of course we've got good security, of course we're all over this. You don't know. Of course I want to tell you that because I'm trying to sell my product. If you can bring in a third-party auditor to have a look at that standard, to have a look at the extent to which that vendor meets that standard, and then attest to the fact they have reached ISO 27001 or a SOC 2 type standard, that's a third-party review and a regular review which allows for that audit. And then, that's achieving two things in a way, and I guess we can come on to talk about the audit type clause, but it's a third party demonstrating and validating that there's a certain level of compliance. It's a third, if you consider ISO 27001 appropriate to protection, it could be something that's useful. I think the one thing I will say to the lawyers out there is we often see standard documents, particularly on the custom side, with automatic warranties that businesses will meet ISO 1 or SOC 2 standards, and these kind of standards are thrown around quite a lot in the deal context. You really need to be looking at what is appropriate given what's being processed and how the systems work. In a number of scenarios, when you talk about SaaS models, a number of SaaS platforms are built within a wider stack of technology built on another host. So
Yeah.
actually, when it's being hosted by a GCP or a Microsoft Azure or a AWS, we're actually probably more interested in the ISO standards and compliance within that host than the underlying SaaS business that's building its platform on that host, etc. So yeah, that appropriateness of what and appropriateness to who, asking those questions is key. And then you kind of go from the sublime to the ridiculous. You can find some of the larger businesses out there who've all got their certification screens, and it's almost anything you've ever thought of comes up as a logo and a badge and a mark, and it just sort of talks to sophistication and maturity, and it does to a degree, and that's one of the things smaller businesses fight against. It's just as you take that deep breath, Alex, to go over your next comment. The other thing we should say about appropriate is over time we find there may be slightly more rules. So under the old rules, the German BSDG used to be a bit more prescriptive about what security measures should be in place. And if you ever did a German deal, you found people trying to mimic the types and categories of security that were prescribed in that BSDG. Now that's gone because we're in a world of GDPR, but we may see those kind of country-specific deviations or recommendations or industry-specific deviations coming in. The other thing is, if we look back to the world of life under the directive, it was very clear to anybody operating in the UK, for example, that if you had a mobile device as a business and you weren't in data on that device, you were going to get in trouble. And ICO, with the marks expenses enforcement and a number of different enforcements, constantly came back to throwing down slightly more enforcement and criticizing businesses when they didn't have encryption. That's an example of an expectation which came from the regulator, kind of became quasi-law. It wasn't the law, but it kind of goes back to what's appropriate. It's what's appropriate to the type of data and what's appropriate. Well, the regulator was beginning to say encryption on a mobile device is appropriate, and that became something that we've started to recommend. So this is where our privacy pros and colleagues really need to think about what they're doing and who they're working with, because we're good privacy lawyers. We understand enough about technology. We don't necessarily understand everything about security. So relying on security professionals to help you with what's good and appropriate is important, because their perspective is going to be all key. I'm sure there are a few security experts out there, and we're sitting next to Paul, who's got a fantastic understanding of some of this. But it's definitely an area where kind of collective responsibility applies in terms of determining what is good and what should be done. And you certainly want to be relying on those with a little bit more security expertise. And I know some of our clients have to go externally to find that when they're in growth mode, because they haven't necessarily got all of that capability in-house. So.
Yeah, and you predicted one of my top tips coming up later.
Sorry,
to get those guys in the room.
He was robbed.
Never mind, I wrote it down. All right, so let's maybe we'll skip past the next two. You can read at your leisure. It's just a little more detail on what security means, the three sort of typical aspects. See this a lot in US deals, that's how they define it, and what state of the art means. You can, and we'll send you the slides later, but worth probably mentioning these. So these are the GDPR breach fines that have, well, the significant ones that have been announced so far. I'm sure most of you have heard of most of these. The Netherlands, that's the first big fine the AP has given, nearly €500,000 for a hospital breach. Berlin, they haven't announced the figure, and for the German readers out there, you can see that it's going to be in the multi-millions. Bulgaria accidentally leaked the tax details of pretty much the entire population. There's a significant fine there. And then the two UK ones, which I'm sure everyone in Britain has heard of, Marriott and British Airways, both of which they haven't been, well, they've been announced, haven't they? It's a notice of intent to fine. Likely, they get some time to give some, what do you call it, to basically argue that down. But the notice of intention, they're both very significant. We've given the dollar figures here because I'm in America, but basically, you can convert that to pounds. It's still a lot of money. So maybe Paul, a little more detail on these two.
Thank you very much, Alex. And in relation to British Airways, I think it's very interesting for deal makers because this is the type of situation which could happen in a transaction as well, right? Because what happened here, according to the different reports, was that there were certain pages on the British Airways website which were compromised, and there was some malware, some bad code which was injected into the British Airways website, which led to customers, whenever they go on the website, when they enter their details, their payment details and so forth, when they wanted to purchase a trip, and that led to the user traffic being diverted to a fraudulent website. And the reason why I mentioned that this is very interesting for deal makers is that when in the context of a transaction, if you purchase, I don't know, another platform, let's say you purchase a code, SDKs or whatever, from third parties, well, you want to make sure as well that, everything is properly logged down and secure. You want to make sure that there is no malware, any bad code on the system, which may be used to steal information from customers. And this is why the ICO said there were poor security arrangements at the company. Moving on to the next incident, the Marriott International. Well, this is more in the context of an M&A deal, because what happened basically was that Marriott bought Starwood Hotels Group in 2016, but what they didn't know was that 2 years before, in 2014, the systems of Starwood Hotels were compromised, according to reports, and it was only discovered in 2018. And that meant that there were a lot of lots of guest records which were leaked, and this meant that that this is the reason why the ICO said that Marriott did not undertake sufficient due diligence when it bought Starwood. It should have done more to secure the system. It should have ensured as well that whenever an acquisition was performed, they should have made sure that they did sufficient investigation, that they checked the systems, and to make sure that there was nothing wrong going on there.
Do we know if Starwood itself didn't know about the breach?
Starwood itself did not know about it.
Didn't know it. Okay, so it wasn't that Marriott failed to ask, have you had any incidents? It's that Starwood didn't know it at the time.
They did not know it at the time, and that's often the case. Many times companies are compromised and they just don't know it. And that's why in the context of a transaction, you cannot just rely on the security practices of the target company. You need to make sure as well that you conduct your own investigation. And I would say that it's the same way as when you are buying a house, right? When you buy a house, you don't just trust what's on a piece of paper or the advertisement in the newspaper or online. You actually go and inspect the house. Well, it's the same when you are conducting any transaction. You have to make sure as well that you conduct some level of investigation. And one of the interesting points as well about this Marriott International case, well, actually there are two interesting points. The first point is that Marriott International is not a company headquartered in the European Union. Actually, it's headquartered in the US. And so it also shows the international reach of the GDPR. And the second point is that according to the ICO, there were 339 million guest records globally which were exposed, and of those 339 million, there were 30 million which related to EU residents and only 7 relating to UK residents. So even if only a small portion of customers are located in the European Union, it doesn't really matter. In this case, most of the affected individuals were outside of the EU, but then because there were some located in the European Union, that was sufficient for the regulator to come in and to initiate enforcement.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to read the full decisions on those two and see if the representations affect the suggested fine. I thought the BA1 was a little harsh because I felt they dealt with it quite well, but let's see what the full decision says and why the ICO decided it was such It was 1.5%, wasn't it? So that's it's on the upper levels of the 2%
I think they're starting to go back to this concept of accountability, in that you need to have looked at your solutions and you need to have had a plan in relation to what you're doing around those principles of compliance. And I think this is important. I was talking to some of our, I was in Amsterdam last week, and we had one of our kind of partners meetings, and we had a breakout group on M&A, and we were talking about deal. And it's very clear that the trend to do a lot of extensive due diligence has really diminished over the years because it's expensive and time consuming. Quite common to rely more on warranty, i.e. contractual promises from the vendor to kind of cover up some of the risk. And there are problems with those warranties around whether or not they're enforceable, because you may be bringing in the management team into your own business and you don't want to hurt them post acquisition. It's an easy way to think, well, I've got a promise, this is all right, let's move on. But actually what we're saying here, and we're seeing a trend saying, no, you've got to have gone and done that due diligence. You've got to have lifted the hood and done your own investigation, as Paul says. So there's a trend there. Now, as a poor commercial lawyer and privacy expert who has worked for many corporate colleagues in the past, we rarely get brought in early enough. We rarely get enough time to do that kind of due diligence, and it will take time, and it does. You do need a level of information in order to perform that investigation. So it's the kind of thing teams need to be factoring into their timelines and planning when thinking about structuring those kind of M&A deals.
Absolutely. And as he said, for more details, we did a recent M&A podcast, so you can check that out. Want to keep us moving though here, so let's switch on to the next one. So these are just the things we thought key considerations. We won't spend too long on this, but is anything that really stands out there we haven't mentioned that you think, right, we have to, this is absolutely crucial? I guess liability, indemnities, we've touched on that. To me, that's always a pain point. And we see customers requesting, unlimited liability and a full indemnity, and that doesn't seem to be market practice anymore, at least in our experience over here.
Yeah, I think we're probably in danger of the key considerations here. Mixes a couple of concepts really. There's the detail in the deal around how you protect data and what you put in place in relation to that data. So is it encrypted during transit? Do you have obligations to ensure it's encrypted at rest? Who holds the keys to that encryption? Other kind of firewall protection, certificates in relation to how that protection works, who can access that data, minimal access, and physical protections and operational protections in relation to that data. And then you've got that enhanced layer where you might commit to those protections within your contract, but then back up those promises with contractual promises, and that may be the specific promises about the way data is protected or handled, or it may be additional protections by way of giving claims of action, be it on an indemnity basis or the ability to contractually recover. And of course, customers always want see risk, see big numbers. We've just seen Paul talking about more risks, and ever since that Marriott and BA case, we've definitely found that the talking about security principles in a simple DPA has become more complicated. Talking about the liability for failures in relation to those security protections has become even more difficult. And of course, you've got a vendor sitting there wanting to do many deals and wanting to limit its liability, ideally to a year's charges or a multiple or some kind of cap. You've got customers there thinking, well, this is my data, this is all important, I don't want to be left with this liability, I'm relying on a third party, and therefore that third party should be liable for all the potential losses. It may not be paying anything like that for the services, but we still want a very large cap on liability, super cap, or some kind of indemnity, so they can automatically recoup. We've had a number of quite heated negotiations in the last month around unlimited indemnities, so essentially writing a blank check to recover. And is that right? Well, it might be if you're a customer, but I think if you're a customer, you've got to ask some questions about a vendor that's doing that kind of deal when they're doing 1,000 of these deals a year, because ultimately if something goes wrong, that vendor's in a lot of trouble. And It is for the vendor to protect his own business and its own liability. And I think it's unrealistic in some circumstances to expect the kind of things that certain customers throw at our table. And we're clearly here in Silicon Valley working with more vendors than we are customers. But of course, a number of our vendors are also customers as they buy on sub-processing services and others within the stack. So we're seeing both sides of these deals. And of course, you've always got to think, if you're a primary provider of services, where am I squeezed? Because you've got to be able to recover that loss. And if your host fails you, you're going to get squeezed if you can't recover much off your host. And if your customer wants more than you can recover off your host, you're sat there in the middle taking pain. So that kind of apportionment, the contractual chaining of liability is something definitely want to be paying a bit of attention to, right?
Yeah, I think you used the phrase, you don't want to get stuck between a rock and AWS, because eventually you're going to come up against the 12-month fees maximum limit, and it's a bit of risk apportionment there. Just briefly say third-party vendors, that was significant in the Target breach, for example, from 2014. It was failure by the third party, I think it was a security camera provider that enabled access to their credit card system, and hence that massive breach. So the due diligence should go that deep. All right, let's keep things rolling as we're coming up to time. I'm going to use my presenter prerogative to skip over this one, but you can read it in your...
It's in the slide deck anyway.
Yeah, it's in the slide deck. Just wanted to mention audit rights, because GDPR, I think, was a classic EU fudge. I don't think they could agree on whether audits meant on-site, so they just have this phrase, audits including inspections, in Article 28. And I think the two views, if you're a customer, inspections means we can come in and do a full on-site audit, whereas if you're a vendor, you say, well, inspections means inspecting our documents or our ISO certifications, and therefore you don't have the right to come on. Paul, do you see that? Do you have any compromises where you can agree between those two positions?
I would say it's it's quite difficult, but it really depends as well, on the bargaining power of each party. So it's not something where there is a clear-cut solution in each case.
No, no, and it depends on the all this stuff. It depends what's appropriate. It's a good idea if you have a certification, you can offer that and then answer questions beyond that, or perhaps have an on-site audit in the event of, say, a security failing or a request of a regulator. And I just mentioned whose security schedule. So as what you might have a big argument over whose DPA to use, and then you might have a separate argument over whose security schedule to use. And again, there's no right answer there. If you're a massive vendor, you probably have something that's pretty robust and you won't budge from it. But it's really for the parties to kind of agree what both is happy with and offer. Say, well, here's what we're offering. If that works for you, that's what you're getting.
And I think that's always very interesting, right, Alex? Because I mean, you get a large bank or a large telco just throw their 60-page security schedule in, and if you're a vendor and you've been, you really understand your systems and solutions and you've designed something to be secure, it's very odd to think that you should bend entirely to work to someone else's security procedures where you've spent all this time on your own and you understand your own. And I think those of you who are out there are in the habit of throwing over your own schedules, expect some robust pushback from us when we're acting against you, because it really does, well, one, make the negotiations far more complicated, and I think there's a little bit of signing up to soften and understand. But if as a vendor, do you really understand how you're committing to all of that, how you translate what you're committing to contractually to your own operational procedures where you've got different procedures in place? I don't think it's the best solution for security, and I think it's sometimes a relatively naive way of approaching things. I understand people putting their own DPAs in place, but forcing security on others is something that's definitely up for a discussion. So.
Yeah, and that brings us conveniently onto some top tips, because I think we're kind of touching on the second one there. Have someone from your InfoSec team, or it might not be a team, it might just be one individual, but having them on the call can really help, because security really is a bit of a blocker in a lot of these deals. And if you have two lawyers arguing in principle about what appropriateness is, it can really help to smooth things to have someone, especially if you're on the vendor side, from your security, so that if the bank says, well, we need to do this and this, but you have someone from Intersect saying, well, we're doing this, and that's why, it can really assuage any of those fears. And what else is important here? So, Paul, did you mention that cybersecurity playbook?
Yeah, what happens many times is that when you have an incident, many times organizations are just trying to figure out, what's going on, who should they contact, and so forth. And that's not the right time to be figuring out what's happened, right? Because you only have 72 hours, to report a breach. And many times, especially in large organizations, you have lots of different stakeholders who need to be involved. You need to know who to contact. What happens if someone is on vacation? You need to get a deputy and so forth. And if you're trying to figure out who you should contact when an incident happens, you're not really going to make it, because it's going to take a lot of time to figure out what to do. And clearly laying out the different steps as well, so that when you are in a stressful situation, when an incident happens, you know exactly what to do. That helps a lot, because sometimes you may need to make certain decisions, and if people are not around, if they are acting under stress and so forth, they may not necessarily make the right decisions. And having already made those decisions will help a lot and make sure that everything goes along smoothly according to the plan.
Yeah, absolutely. Having a breach plan is crucial, and also having this kind of negotiation playbook in place is also very helpful. So if you know that you can flex on, say, a breach notification timetable for your customers, and your starting position is not to have a deadline, but then if you're forced, you could agree 72 hours or 48 hours. Having that stuff argued, if it comes up again and again and again, can really save a lot of time in these scenarios. And then, yeah, third one, any obvious gaps, be ready to explain them. I mean, customers will look at these kind of contracts and security schedules a lot, and if you're missing something obvious, it's going to keep coming up. So either plug the gap or have a decent answer ready. All right, so with that, we're just coming up to time, a little over. So you have our lovely, slightly distorted mugshots there, our details. That's also the link to the YouTube channel if you want to go direct, or like I said, you can search Field Fisher Silicon Valley and you'll find this and all our other webinars we've uploaded. And then also another plug for our blog. If you're not subscribed, I highly recommend it. Some great content there from our wide team across the States and across Europe, updated pretty regularly with some good insight. Next one, we haven't set a date yet.
We haven't set a date. We're looking at the weaponization of DSARs, bringing back our famous employment colleague Gemma Chubb and team. But watch this space and LinkedIn. If you want colleagues to be added to the list, please let us know. We'll let them add them to the distribution list. Yeah, coming to an inbox near you soon, hopefully. The other thing to say is a few of us are going to be out at IAPP at the PSR in Vegas over the weekend of this week. I'll be teaching CIPPE and appearing on a panel alongside LinkedIn and Twilio, talking about M&A and privacy issues. So a little bit of overlap with today's session, but also some great perspective. Gemma Chubb, they're talking about employment issues and employment in the workplace with some practical examples in a workshop. So we'll be there with her very best BBC voice. Yes. So let us know if you're in Vegas. Drop us a line. I'm sure we'll be out one evening for a little bit of social if any of you fancy joining us there. But thank you for listening. Thanks to Alex for his efforts today in hosting, and to Paul for appearing alongside us. Anybody wants to hear anything specific or address any topics, let us know and we'll see if we can factor it into our schedule here. So thank you for listening.
Yep, thanks all. I'm going to try and not mess up the ending, and we'll see you next time.